My speech is entitled Collaborators, Bystanders, and Heroes. Of the 150,000 Jews living in Paris, France in 1940 at the beginning of the Nazi occupation, only 50,000 survived by the time Paris was liberated in 1945. My parents were Jewish teenagers living in France at this time. My father often talked about growing up as the target of anti-Semitism. As a young child, he used to get into fights in the schoolyard as the only Jew in the school, when he was called and taunted for his Jewishness. These childhood bullies grew up in an atmosphere of anti-Semitism. By the time the Nazis had occupied Paris, there were plenty of French citizens enthusiastically helping the Nazis to deport and murder their Jewish neighbors. In 1939, when France entered the war against Germany, my dad's best friend and neighbor, René, was 2 years older than him. He was drafted and sent to the front line. He got captured by the Germans, and somehow he escaped, and he returned back to his apartment in Paris. His father, Mr. Duschler, was afraid that the Germans would come looking for him. So my dad and his family hid René in their apartment for several weeks. 3 years later, René's father, Mr. Duschler, would play a key role in my family's escape from Paris. During those 3 years, from 1939 until 1942, the anti-Jewish incidents continued. All Jews were required to have their identity card stamped Jewif, or Jew. One day my parents they had just met and they were in love and they were sitting in a cafe when they were approached by two men who identified themselves as the secret police. When my dad showed his identity card, they threatened him because his Jewif stamp was on the wrong side. He better get it corrected and fixed or else. The incidents became more menacing when my grandfather was exiting the subway. He was getting off at the Belleville metro station, and as he approached street level, he was horrified to see that all three of the other exits, were surrounded, completely encircled by Germans and French police who were capturing all Jews exiting the subway on that day and transporting them into trucks. In June 1942, all Jews were required to wear the star. My dad dressed really sharp, trying to maintain his pride, trying to hide his pain, but he felt demeaned, degraded, humiliated. He felt branded like an animal. He knew he could not stay in Paris any longer. The pain was so intense. Wearing the star was the final insult. He knew where he would go. He would go to Ceyroux, small farm town in the south of France where he and his sister spent many summers. But how would he get there? Well, that's where Mr. Duschler came in. Mr. Duschler knew a man who worked in Vierzon. Vierzon, at the time, was one of the largest and busiest railroad stations in all of France. But it was heavily patrolled by German soldiers with rifles. There were searchlights going in all different directions and lots of tracks. But he knew a railroad worker who lived and worked in Vierzon. My dad always referred to him as the cheminot. I never learned his name. But this one cheminot risked his life many times for my family. He alone smuggled my mom, my dad, my grandparents, my aunt, and countless other Jews to safety. Under the cover of darkness, with guns all around, searchlights, it was a very, very dangerous situation. He did eventually get captured and executed by the Germans. My dad took the train to Ceyroux. When he arrived at Ceyroux, a couple days later, the mayor of the town, Mayor Deguette, gave my dad a new identity card. This identity card changed his name from Jacob Joseph to a more neutral French-sounding Jack, changed his occupation to cultivator, farmer. Ceyroux was very hilly and had a lot of farms. They farmed potatoes mostly. And no more Jew stamp. My dad rented a small room for him and his family to stay, and they stayed there for 2 years until the liberation of Paris in 1945. The room was small. There was no running water. It was bare. But the people of Ceyroux helped make this one room home. 3 years ago, my niece Danielle went back to Ceyroux to present the mayor and the people of the town with a plaque for what they did for our family, because they hid my dad's family and my mom's family. And it took the whole town, the cooperation and the silence of the whole town. Any one of them could have let the word out that there were Jews hiding there, but they did not. My grandfather worked the farm all week, and on weekends, he was a tailor, and he made overalls for the farmers. He also made a communion suit for one of the younger generation. In exchange, they gave him eggs and butter and much-needed items to make him feel at home. After 6 months, the Germans took over all of France, and Ceyroux was no longer in the free zone. At this time, my father received a communication to report to Guerre, and in Guerre, he would be reporting for service travail obligatoire. That is forced labor. All French citizens, all Frenchmen of age, were required to work for the German war effort. My dad didn't know what to do. If he goes to report, they'll find out he's Jewish and he'll be deported. If he doesn't go, the Germans will come after him. Well, the people of the town referred my dad to a man who worked in Guerre. He worked in the municipal building there. So my dad went to this man and asked him for help. And he told my dad, "Don't worry, I'll investigate, I'll see, and I'll tell you what's happening." So the day that my dad was supposed to report, he observed what happened. And he was horrified to see that all the Jewish men who reported were immediately taken to the backyard and loaded onto trucks and being deported. So he told my dad, "Jack, I don't know where they're going, but don't go." So my dad was afraid and quickly went back to Ceyroux and told everybody to hide. And they slept in the woods and they slept in the barn for many days in fear the Germans would come after them. My dad often described how the kindness of strangers restored his faith in humanity. Here I have a picture of my niece and my nephew with the people of Ceyroux. Whenever there was a threatening incident, there was always someone who came to the rescue, some kind gesture. Never underestimate the power of a kind gesture. In July 1942, during Le Grand roundups, the big roundups in Paris, the elderly neighbor across the courtyard gave my 8-year-old aunt at the time a warning signal, a very threatening warning signal, just enough to warn her that they were coming to deport them on that day. And it was just moments before that knock on the door. Without that warning signal, my mom and her family would have been deported on that day. I often wonder how the bystanders could just stand by and do nothing, watching children and others going to their death or going to who knows where. If more people had spoken out, These cousins who I never met, the little boy who was 8, and the family with the children, all I know is their picture. Many, many extended family in Poland and many of my relatives in Paris did not return. I wonder, why did nobody stand up for them? Anti-Semitism is on the rise in France today and in many places in Europe. It's very disturbing. Why have they not learned the lessons from the Holocaust? Aren't they teaching the Holocaust? A year ago in Toulouse, France, an Islamic radical murdered a rabbi and his small children for no reason, just because they were Jewish. The new anti-Semitism is called anti-Israel. They're bringing back Nazi propaganda against the Jews. It's very disturbing. Despite all the hatred and hardships that my dad encountered, he continued to believe that life is beautiful until his death 2 years ago. I want to say a thank you on behalf of my family to all the people who stood up for them, and there were many, friends and strangers. But I can't really tell this story as well as they can tell it themselves. So I encourage everybody to go to my website on YouTube, Bev Margo, BEVMARGO, and listen to these stories firsthand from my dad in the upper left, my mom, and my uncle has a very interesting story to hear. And I encourage you, if you see a neighbor in distress, experiencing injustice or taunts for whatever reason, there's always something you can do. Thank you.